that there will be a quiz today. Last time I said people will be showing. It's all right. Let me do a quick review. You'll want to pay attention. You want to pay attention all the time, but now, especially since you know there's going to be a quiz, you should. This is how you. This feeling you have right now that there's going to be a quiz. That should be with you all the time. I mean, not all the time, not outside of class, and there's kind of anxiety that's unnecessary. But I mean, each time you come to class, be prepared for a quiz. All that means is review your notes from last time and do the readings for today's class. The benefit today is you know the quiz you'll be allowed your notes for this quiz. So this quiz has two parts. One, of course, to test your content knowledge, content mastery. Also, the other, to test your capacity for note-taking. If you did poorly on the test, in particular on the multiple choice portion of the test, it's probably due to not taking good notes or not paying sufficient attention in class. And so this is kind of a test for that. What's going on? Computer's messed up. Okay. And so there's two things to look at. Sorry, the computer is confusing me. It's frozen. I hate it when that happens. Anyway, let me review where we were left off last time so we catch up to the last bit of libertarianism, because we ended with a discussion of libertarianism with respect to free will. Then we'll do the quiz, and then we'll move into the next topic, which, as we've already seen, is fairly well interconnected with questions of identity, with questions of free will, namely the personal identity question. So, last time, we started our discussion I demonstrated to you that you had no free will when I asked you to stand and you all stood. That proved that you didn't have free will. That was pushing the Baron de Holbach hard determinist stance. The hard determinist, going all the way back to de Holbach's claim, remember, no one chose to be born, and from that moment, you are conditioned. Here you are now, but you are conditioned by all that came before you. Your passions, your desires, your emotions, these are things that are outside of your control, and yet those are the things that cause you to do what you do. If you don't have control over those causes, then you don't have control over your actions. You don't have control over where you were born. You don't have control over to whom you were born, or when you were born. You don't have control over your genetics. You don't have control over your biology. De Holbach would go further. You don't have control over your desires. You don't even have control over your thoughts. Your thoughts are not your own. They're caused by that which came before you, and you are not in charge of those things. That's hard determinism, in contrast to soft determinism, which is just another fancy term for what? What's another term for soft determinism? Compatibilism, not indeterminism. Indeterminism is something different. We'll see in a moment. But soft determinism says there is, although there's ways of looking at indeterminism as a kind of compatibilism, but I don't want to confuse things. But soft determinism says the laws of physics hold, cause and effect relationships, all that holds. The world is deterministic. If it weren't, we wouldn't be able to successfully engage in science as we do. However, the soft part of it is there's room for freedom. It isn't inconsistent to say the world is determined and we're free at the same time. They're compatible. They fit together. For instance, W.T. Stace is what kind of compatibilist is Stace? Do you remember? Two kinds of compatibilism. Which is Stace? Traditional and deep self. Which one is Stace? He's a traditional compatibilist. He's the one that says there are two conditions, and Rauhut mimics that. He shows this in the Rauhut text too. Two conditions for an action to be free. First, it's caused by an internal state, psychological state of the agent in question, the person in question. And second, there are no external constraints. That's traditional compatibilism. In contrast to the wrong, according to Stace, the wrong definition of free will as uncaused act. That's, according to Stace, the wrong way of defining freedom. If you define free will as an uncaused act, and then you look around for freedom of the will, or free acts, you're going to say, well, since I can't find any actions that are uncaused, I can't find any uncaused things, it must be the case that there's no freedom. But, as Stace points out, that's the wrong definition of freedom. Freedom simply means you are acting in such a way that it's caused, that's important, it's caused by an internal desire. And there aren't external constraints. Everything has a cause, fine. Free acts are those that are caused in the right way. And in a way, there's a response to the indeterminist view, because remember, indeterminism with quantum mechanics, remember that brief bit we talked? The indeterminist says, look, there's got to be room for freedom because the world isn't wholly determined. In fact, there is a large part of our existence, namely the tiny elements of us, the subatomic particles, where there's randomness. Quantum mechanics tells us that the laws of physics don't seem to apply in the same way at the very, very small, at the level of the quantum. There's indeterminacy, and therefore there's randomness, and therefore the argument goes, there's room for freedom. But we saw that there are problems with that. One is that randomness doesn't equal freedom. If it's completely random, in what way am I responsible for it? Why did I do that? I don't know. I don't know why it happened. It was totally random and totally indeterminate. That doesn't sound great. That sounds worse than determinate. And then there was the additional problem with indeterminism, that fallacy of what? Fallacy of composition, where you say what is true of the parts is necessarily true of the whole? No, not necessarily. Sometimes, maybe, but not necessarily, not without further argument. Were it the case that I'm free because at the quantum level there's indeterminacy that makes me up, and therefore that indeterminacy bubbles up to the surface, so to speak, to the whole, then I'd have to say of tables that are made of basically the same stuff, they're also free because they're made of the same bits, and there's indeterminacy at that level. But that would be weird. In fact, that would be absurd, which tells us we're using a specific kind of reasoning there called a reductio ad absurdum. So the compatibilists, traditional compatibilists, had those two conditions. That sounds really nice, but we saw a counterexample with that too, remember. I kind of jumped ahead here. The compatibilist says an act is free if it's caused by the internal state of an agent, and then there's no external constraint. But then we came up with counterexamples to that, such as you deciding to major in business. Right? Why are you majoring in business, for example? Well, I desire to major in business. Is it your desire? Nobody's causing or forcing you to do this or that, but you're acting on what your parents desire, for example. That's from the textbook. It's really your parents who want you to be a business major and not something else, like a philosophy major. But you really want to be a philosophy major. That's your authentic desire, obviously. And so you're acting, however, on the desire of your parents. So it's not an authentic desire. You go and buy a product because you have a desire for it. But the product, that desire was manufactured. It was implanted, so to speak, by commercials because they work. They work really well. Or you have a desire for a cigarette. But do you really want the cigarette? We talked about that, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but probably nobody wants to want all the stuff that's in cigarettes. Nobody wants tar in their lungs, but they want the cigarette anyway. That tells us probably it's not a free act, even though I act on the desire that is my own, my desire for the cigarette, and nobody's making me do it or not do it. No external constraint. So smoking that cigarette seems to meet the two conditions of traditional compatibilism. And yet our intuitions tell us, wait a minute, this looks like addiction. Addiction's not free. Therefore there's a problem with traditional compatibilism. And here's where deep self-compatibilism comes in and says, those conditions need to be met, but also a third condition, namely that the desire that is causing your action is authentically your own. And I'll leave it at that because the debates continue on that. How do we establish what is an authentic desire? How do we establish that it's truly mine? That's beyond the scope of our discussion here. And finally, we left off with libertarianism. Somebody sum up libertarianism for us. And then we'll move on. What's libertarianism? Yes?
The belief of how libertarianism works is that it believes that humans as agents have special causal powers.
That's right. So could you expand on that?
Because we have the power to think, we have the power to do all kinds of things, unlike ordinary objects which can only be controlled by outside factors like wind, rain.
Right. And other physical factors. So event causation tells us, look, these objects, or I think the text uses dominoes, that's a fine enough analogy. This domino is going to fall only if this domino prior to it, an event causes it to fall. But that domino is not going to fall unless the event prior to it causes that one to fall. And on it goes. This is very different than agent causation, in which we have a new cause and effect chain beginning, and there's nothing prior to the agent. Because if we had to invoke another cause that's bringing about the action that the agent's doing, we've left, excuse me, we've left the realm of libertarianism. We're away from freedom again. The libertarian is saying, and you use the right language, special. We're special. I don't know what happened there, excuse me. We have special causal powers. We're different than mere events that have to have something prior to them to cause them and bring them about. We're special in that we can begin our own causal series. The Rowlett text, I think, engages in a bit of hyperbole and perhaps even a straw man fallacy by exaggerating the claims. They give the example of saying, or Rowlett gives the example, the libertarian basically thinks that each individual is like a god. You remember that example? Where the god is acting with no prior causes bringing about their actions, as if they're bringing into the world out of nothing a new causal series. I think that's too strong. I think that's too exaggerated and too easy to refute. If that's the worldview, then no one would really be a libertarian unless you really thought you had magical powers. Because that's almost what it sounds like. You're like a little god every time you act. That's too strong. That doesn't mean there aren't problems with libertarians. As you recall, libertarianism sounds nice, especially for Americans, where in the United States we have freedom of choice, responsibility, individual responsibility, equal opportunities. If you make it in this world, in this country, if you succeed, that means you got gumption, whatever the hell that is. That means you've worked hard and you deserve it because you did it all yourself. You are, as a free agent, responsible for what and where you are in life. Good for you if you succeed. That's why we laud people who have succeeded. That's why we think they're impressive. You may say, no, we don't find monetary success to be all there is, but you think it's very important. We know we do because we get bombarded with it every single day with televisions, movies, advertisements, and so on. Success equals accumulation of wealth. If you don't accumulate wealth, guess what? That's also on you. There's a sense in which we want that to be the case because then we can justify. That's where they are because of their actions, because of their choices. They're responsible for where they are. It's not our fault, it's not the system's fault, and so on. Do you see there's positives to that, but there's also negatives to that? That's where they are because of what they did. Can't you imagine counterexamples in which you find somebody on the street who's homeless and without a job, not because of choices that they made, but because of situations into which they have been thrown? Libertarianism seems to perhaps leave, if we take it too far, leave out that possible explanation. We get a question?
It was just like a comment more.
Sure.
But what you were explaining, it kind of reminds me of this movie called The Serious Man.
I don't know that.
So basically in the movie, it's this guy where he doesn't really know what's going on, and basically he's like, what's happening? And like you hear him yelling it randomly, and he like, it just kind of seems every negative thing just kind of happens to him, but he doesn't take any action.
Well, who's in it? This sounds familiar.
He's the guy who stars in, I can just look it up.
Okay, well, now it's starting to sound familiar. And the idea is that the term we used before from Thomas Nagel, moral luck. There's all sorts of things that you are born into, situations that you're born into, maybe biological situations, maybe, and it's not coincidental that a lot of people who are homeless also have mental issues. Did they choose those mental issues? That's a weird thing to say, like the example of the book, where the mom is a libertarian and her daughter has chronic depression, and she says something like, just get out of bed, my little free agent, or something like that, which is a horrible thing to say with somebody with chronic depression. Just turn that frown upside down, that phrase we talked about. Did I talk about that last time? Yeah, you don't ever say that to anyone, especially if that person has chronic depression. Chronic depression implies it's more than just, I'm sad, and I wish I were happy, I'll just be happy. It doesn't quite work that way, it seems. If we take libertarianism too far, it leads to there being no external sources, external causes that you're not responsible for. But that seems way too extreme. And it takes away the possibility of even being victims. Did you want to add?
But yeah, like what you were saying, but like all these negative things happen to him, and he's like, I haven't done anything to have these happen to me.
Uh-huh.
But like it's more of like him not doing anything is why these like negative things are happening.
Oh, well, that's different. There's the sin of omission versus the sin of commission. I can still be responsible for something by virtue of not doing something.
Yeah.
So I'm still the cause of it by not doing something. I see a child drowning in water right in front of me, and I just say, well, that's unfortunate. Free will. You brought it on yourself, kid. And then I walk away. I think I'm morally responsible for the death, even though, I may not get the death penalty because I didn't murder the child, but I think I should be punished because I could have very easily just walked over and then I didn't have to get wet. I just pulled the child out. By not doing something, I play a role in that child's unnecessary death, I guess you could say. Where did I see it here? Yeah.
Well then, what do libertarians think of genetics? How do they?
I think that they can. It depends. So William James would be an example of a libertarian, and Jean-Paul Sartre would be too, although he changed his mind on this. I think there are degrees to it. But once you've admitted that there are degrees to libertarianism, then you've got an issue. Because am I a completely free agent? In every case, I can't deny the fact that there are genetic predispositions. But I guess the argument would be, here are people who have this genetic predisposition, but don't engage in these actions, which may be negative or something. And here are people who do have that predisposition, but did act on those predispositions. What's the difference? One chose well and the other didn't, I think is how it might go. But again, once you open the can of worms that there's degrees, then you're saying, well, it may not be the case that you're completely free in every instance. But if I'm going to be held morally responsible and let's say imprisoned, or let's say executed by the state, we better hope as a state who executes people. Actually, does California still have the death penalty? Or is that on a moratorium? We still have the death penalty?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we as a state better be damn sure that the person we execute is, bless you, sufficiently responsible. How much is that? 100% responsible? Yeah, I kind of hope so. But is anyone ever 100% responsible for anything that happens to you and anything that you do? I'm not sure. The act of the penalty of the death penalty, that's as absolute and 100% as it gets. It's not reversible, right? And so there's questions of whether or not, see that the free will discussion isn't just a metaphysical, esoteric thought. It has to do with all sorts of implications in real world scenarios. That's the ethical problem. There's another problem that will bring us to the next topic, which is personal identity. And that is, what is this self that we're talking about that has agential or powers of agents, special powers as you put it. And special is the right word because it's not obvious how this can be explained. Where is it? So if you look in Rauhut on page 100, this is where we left off last time. You've got the problems of ethics and victimhood, and whether or not there are victims with respect to libertarianism if it's taken too far. But you also have this one having to do purely with metaphysics. With the libertarian view, we introduce too much, as the text puts it, metaphysical baggage. Did I talk about that last time? I don't think I did. That's a bit of a mouth, metaphysical baggage. You need to check your metaphysical baggage. $75 a bag. So, stupid, sorry. The idea of metaphysical baggage, it doesn't sound like it's much. What do you mean, baggage? I'm just bringing in the notion of an agent. That's common sense. What's common sense? That I, as a thinking self, a person, a mind, whatever, can cause things to happen in the world. But there are two things you just introduced into the world that need explanation. So we have, number one, a mystery. Are we free? The answer, yes, because we are agents and we have special powers. Notice the word special again. That's a problem, and it potentially violates a principle known as Occam's razor. Do you know what Occam's razor is? I know we touched on it, but only briefly. Simplicity, the principle of cutting away the extraneous bits of your hypothesis. Put another way, if I have two competing hypotheses to explain one situation or phenomena, and let's imagine the two hypotheses are equally good in many respects, but one multiplies entities, multiplies things that need to be explained. Right? Remember the example of the pyramids? How were the pyramids built? It's a mystery, because it's so amazing that the ancient Egyptians could have built these pyramids. How could they have done it? It's a mystery. How can we explain it? Well, if you watch the History Channel, what's one explanation? Well, it's the History Channel, so not just aliens, ancient aliens. Or else, why is it on the History Channel? Well, it's ancient, so that's why. Why is Ice Road Trucking on the History Channel, you might ask yourself? Let me rephrase, the History Channel. That's what it's not history. Although they have that tagline, making history every day. Or history is made every day, or some nonsense to justify putting on that crap show. No offense if you like Ice Road Truckers, I'm sure it's great. But it doesn't belong on the History Channel. So on the History Channel you'll hear that the pyramids were built by aliens. Why? Well, the technology to build such pyramids simply wasn't there at the time of the ancient Egyptians. There's no way they could have done it. Is that true? Well, there is a competing hypothesis that could explain how the pyramids were built, namely thousands and thousands and thousands of slave laborers. They did have the mathematics capable of computing what they needed to compute. They did have pulleys. They did have wheels. They could have moved these giant blocks. That's one hypothesis. Slave labor is not something that needs further explanation. We have an understanding of what that is. Aliens? We don't. We don't have an explanation. In fact, we've multiplied the things that need to be explained. Now we have a mystery. How are the pyramids built? By aliens. What are aliens? I don't know. Where do they come from? I don't know. Why do they come here? I don't know. Why do they build the pyramids? We don't know any of that. So you've multiplied the mysteries in trying to answer one question. That's not the best hypothesis. That's certainly not a simpler hypothesis. That relates to agents and agent causation here. And it's not going to be obvious to you, certainly not as obvious as the ancient aliens. But when I invoke a self that has special powers, and we'll see this with identity question in a moment after the quiz, I'm invoking something that needs further explanation. I don't need much to explain how one event causes another, although scientifically that's actually quite difficult. But I do now have to explain what an agent is and how an agent is somehow outside of the laws of cause and effect, such that it's not constrained by that, and it can cause its own series of events. Put more simply in the form of a mind-body debate, how can a self that isn't physical, which is part of the presumption here, cause something to happen in a physical world? Two fundamental issues brought about by invoking libertarianism. What is an agent and what is agent causation? That's what we'll get to in the coming days. Until then, I'll stop for a second and ask if you have any questions. And I'll say that you don't. Now I'll pass out the quiz. Please don't mark on the quiz. Causally connected to what we've been covering so far. As I've mentioned, it's hard to do metaphysics. Actually, it's hard to do metaphysics at all. Bertrand Russell very famously said, to really do metaphysics well, you can only really do it for like 3 minutes a day. Beyond that, you're wasting your time. I don't know if he was exaggerating. I'm certain that he was, because he did metaphysics way more than 3 minutes a day. But the connections between issues of issues of free will, issues of identity and what personhood is, as we'll see, and issues of mind and body, as we've already noted, they're interconnected. We couldn't talk about free will and libertarianism without already jumping a little bit ahead and talking about what a self is. And that's our question now. We're trying to ascertain, when I speak of I, what does that refer to? What am I pointing to when I use that in a sentence? I think, therefore I am. Or I am free. I am responsible for my actions. The metaphysical question at issue here is, what does that refer to? The second question is, if it refers to anything at all, what is it? Is it a unified thing? Or is it a multiplicity of things with parts and so on that constantly undergo change? And does it continue identically through time? So I have this issue is often called the problems of personal identity. Or going back to people like John Locke, David Hume, both of whom wrote a paper with the exact same title, of personal identity. We need to know what identity means, we need to know what a person is, and then we need to know what exactly we're talking about when we put those two things together. So we can use this I am what I am, but the question, have I always been, I think, is an important question here. Some of the issues that we can look at, some of the different approaches. Let's see. Since this is a metaphysical question, remember what metaphysics is addressing. Metaphysics is addressing a fundamental question. In this case, what is the self? There are sociological questions, there are psychological questions, there are religious, cultural, gender, racial, and so on. We can add to that list that relate to questions of personal identity. And I think they're important, and I think we ought not dismiss them. But what we're interested in Aristotle's sense, is the primary, more fundamental question of what is the substance, what is the thing, to the extent that there is one, that has all of those. That has sociological and psychological features, that has a religion, that belongs to a culture, that has a gender, that has a race, and so on. I'm presuming that the metaphysical question is prior to those, that it's more fundamental in a way. That's what we mean by metaphysical. You might disagree, and I would understand perhaps why, when you look at certain issues, that one fundamentally defines themselves by some of these other factors. And you could see that. And if you've read certain texts like, there's a lot of examples, but one of them might be Black Like Me from John Howard Griffin. Have you ever read that? Story about a reporter from the North in the 1950s, I think it was. He was a middle-aged, white, relatively affluent male in the 1950s as a journalist, and he was told by his journalist friends in the South that there was no race relations problem. Things were fine. He didn't buy that, and anyone who has any understanding of history of the United States knows that in Mississippi, for instance, in the 1950s, to say that there was no race problem is simply wrong. So he wanted to confirm this, and he famously changed his appearance. He changed the way he looked. He changed his skin color. He changed his hair. He changed the way he talked, the way he walked. He had friends work with him on fitting in, passing as a black male, to study, to get a first-hand experience of what it was like to live in the Deep South in the 1950s United States. And he identified himself as a white male, as John Howard Griffin. He simply had changed superficial elements of himself. And he had basically forgotten about this. And one of his first, upon early arriving in Mississippi, I think it was, passing a church, he sees a white woman come out of the church. It's a wedding or something like that, and she's smiling and laughing. And the way he describes it's quite interesting. He immediately starts smiling, because that's what you do when you make eye contact with somebody who's smiling or laughing. The mirror neurons in your brain, in the motor cortex, light up as if it's you the one that's doing it, and you have a kind of empathetic relationship, so to speak. I'll talk more about that with mind-body discussion. And he kind of describes it in this way that he felt himself smiling and so on. But what is interesting and related to questions of identity, when she made eye contact with him, her smile turned into a frown, to a grimace, or what he called an accusatory stare. He felt as if he were guilty. And later he described it not quite the same way that Chris Rock talks about guilty of driving while black, but that's basically the crime. Walking and making eye contact with a white woman while black. That wasn't a law that he had broken, but it was certainly de facto the case that you can't do that. And she accused him, and he saw that accusation in her perception, in her mirror image of him. And the point of identity here is he changed the way, it fundamentally changed the way he saw himself and how he carried himself and how he saw himself. It affected his sense of self, his identity. And so in that sense, we get an understanding of how important, for instance, race is, or religion is, or gender. There's another story related to this. Nora Vincent, I'm not sure what her background is, but she followed the framework that John Howard Griffin followed in her book called Self-Made Man. She admits that she's somewhat masculine looking already. She wanted to know what it is like to be a male for various reasons. It's a very interesting book. She wore a coat and tie, changed her appearance, cut her hair, and so forth. And she passed as a male in all sorts of different groups. In one case, working for an insurance, I think they were, I don't know what, the salesman group, a group of salespeople, and they're all males. Bowling group, and she even joined a what's it called? A monastery. And the monk apparently knew right away that she was a woman. But what is relevant with respect to identity is she also experienced something similar to that John Howard Griffin did. She perceived herself differently based upon how others perceived her. And by the way, at the end, after 2 years almost of doing this, she had what she called an identity crisis. So showing that there's some clear connection between these things in one's sense of self. But it doesn't tell us necessarily, and I guess the psychological is under this, it doesn't tell us necessarily what is the self, what is the I. Is it the mind? Is it your memories? Is it your personality? Is that what determines you? Is that your identity? And persona, the Latin for personality, literally means mask. You're putting on a persona. Actors would put on personae. That's a relevant point, I think. We might say it's the brain. That's what the self is. That's what the I is. Or a subset of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, or something like that. You might say personality, memory, mind, body generally, as we'll see, is a potential answer to the question of what is the self. One way of getting at this is through a thought experiment. What is it about you that, if removed, would change your identity? You would no longer be the same identical person through time. What is it about you that would change? Excuse me, what is it about you that, if it were removed, would fundamentally change what and who you are? You can start to see where personality, memory, mind, consciousness, these are all interconnected here. Seem to play a pretty important role. And others might argue, as we'll see with the reading for today, as Chaplain Miller argues for, something like the soul is what establishes that self. And I left that open there. We can add more to it as we go. But I want you to be considering this. When you think about yourself, when you think about what is fundamental, not merely what philosophers would call accidental features. The color of your hair, is that a fundamental feature of you? Is that what makes you who and what you are? Probably not. So think about that, and I'm going to return to that question. That's one of the questions we're addressing. In order to distinguish real quick the importance of personal identity, we want to be able to distinguish what kinds of things have identities. Does my cat Hank have an identity? Pictured here. He has a name, but we gave him that name. He didn't call himself Hank. He doesn't even pass what's known as the mirror test. I tried it. Tried to put him up to a mirror. Had a couple friends come over and help me lift him in front of a mirror. Try to get the thing out. He wasn't that big. He was. He was that big. He was huge. But he didn't pass the test. He didn't recognize himself in the mirror. Right? The mirror test is something that elephants can pass. You put a dot or something on their forehead that they can't feel or see unless they're looking into a mirror. And if they try to, upon looking in the mirror, take that thing off, that's at least a low bar condition, so to speak, for self-recognition to some extent. Right? Dolphins can do it. Certain primates can recognize themselves. Babies can't until a certain age. This baby doesn't recognize itself as itself. I'm not sure how they establish when they can. It's an interesting question. But this mirror test is interesting. If you're capable of recognizing yourself, there's at least an inclination, or rather an indication, that there is a self that's separable from other things that you're able to distinguish.
I was gonna say the baby can't see at
Oh.
an early age, so like
Well, they can
can't-
see, but they can't see
it's
well.
Very blurry, like,
Yeah.
very close up or like very far away. So like as they get older, like
And it is
the
fascinating.
becomes clear. So obviously they can sort of
That's true. That's a good point. Granted, it's fascinating how scientists come up with that fact. You know, babies can't see. They can't see very well. Well, how do you know that? How do you know what they see? But there's ways of testing this, and that's true. And there's a connection between this baby not being able to recognize itself and just being, it's just an infant. It doesn't have enough development. But what about when you get older and you can recognize yourself, right? And you start to develop memories. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that one of those kids is me when I was younger. Probably, let's say, this guy. And I don't remember this. Here's my sister Gretchen. Is that relevant? Her name is Gretchen. Is that interesting? Why is that interesting? What's that? How many know why that's relevant? Okay, good. Some of you. Those of you who don't know, I'm just going to assume you didn't do the reading. I could be wrong. You could have just missed the fact that the central character in the reading was named Gretchen. It's a weird name, isn't it? I've never had a student in class named Gretchen. It's a weird name, I have to say. And I tell her that all the time. She's still that tall, by the way. She's older than me. But I don't remember this. I don't remember this picture. My mom tells me, oh, there you are, Christo, with Gretchen. That's how she talks. And this was when you were sitting down. You were like 5 and she was like 7. And you did this and that. Your mom tells you this. But does that mean it happened? And does that mean that's you? I don't remember it. And so a lot of our history is a kind of narrative that others have told us. I don't know what connects me to that. To him. To that. To it. What is that? It's different than me now. How should I speak? That was me back, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Is that the wrong way of talking? How should I say it? What should I say differently there? That is me? Do we want to say that? What should we say?
Version of you.
Hmm?
It's a version of you.
It's a version of me. That's interesting. It's a version of me. And tomorrow, actually, remember I was writing on the board earlier today? Like a minute or two ago? Was that a version of me? Or was that identical to me? Is a version of me the same thing as being identical to me? It doesn't sound like it. It's like this is a beta version. This is the newest edition. It's a different thing, right? The iPhone 9, or what are we at now with the iPhones? Oh, excuse me. Good Lord. I can't believe that.
They skipped a bunch.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they just skip certain numbers.
Why?
Because it's the 10th anniversary of the iPhone. It's been out for 10 years, so they're releasing it.
Arbitrary nonsense. You can't skip a number. That's so. Why not just go, this is the iPhone 100. And it's that good. They might. They probably might. Those sons of bitches. I'm sorry. I don't know why that angers me. What was I saying? I don't know. Versions. So, how about this? You see that? I'm more similar psychologically, and I would guess even physically to an extent, anyone in this room than I am to that. And that's supposed to be me. That doesn't make much sense. Yeah?
Well, but you're genetically exactly the same.
That's true. I'm genetically, my DNA, for the most part, stays the same. But is that how we establish identity of self? We might, insofar as somebody's crime is guilty of a crime, your DNA was found at the scene, therefore you're guilty. Okay. My DNA was found, and yes, let's say I killed that person. But that was 20 years ago. I'm a different person. Remember the story about Stanley Tookie Williams in the text? He started the Bloods, or the Crips, and he's convicted of murder, of a double murder or something like that. And then the state, in California I think it was, executed him. Over 20 years later. Did they execute the right person? Physically, he's a different person. Every 6 or 7 years, what do you know about the cells in your body? Every cell. They regenerate. They become different. They're replaced. Psychologically, are you the same person that you were 20 years ago? How many think that you were the same person you were 20? What does it mean to be the same? That's fundamentally problematic. It seems weird to say I'm identical to that kid, that baby. We wouldn't say, I don't know, I don't know. If you think of, I don't know why baby pictures of Hitler came to mind, but imagine you have I mean, 'cause I'm sure there's pictures of Hitler as a baby, right? Nobody's going to look at that and say, there's Hitler, that's Adolf. Nobody, I don't know, I think I'm going backwards with this, but you see what I'm saying? There's a huge difference. That cannot be the same as Adolf 55 years later. Even though genetically, as you're saying, indeed there's the same DNA, but surely there's more than just DNA that determines our sense of self.
I remember Jeb Bush was saying he'd go back and kill baby Hitler when he was trying to be tough.
Right, that's right. I'm a tough guy. Would you kill Hitler? Yeah, I'd kill baby Hitler. But baby Hitler's not Hitler. That's the right example. Was it Jeb Bush that said that? Yeah, what? Okay, well, that's a weird thing to say. Baby Hitler didn't do anything, right? It's a different entity. Now, what are we talking about? Oh, did I skip ahead? Yeah, I did. This is what I want. What is the difference when I say, that's me, that's the same person? Well, we mean by same, that word is subject to ambiguity. There's a difference between qualitative and what we call numerical identity. When you know this experience when you get a new car or whatever, and then you see it, everyone else who's driving that same kind of car. You know what I'm talking about. You start to notice it. I got that car. And then you wave to them and they don't care because they've had it for long enough that it doesn't matter anymore. But what you mean when you say, I have the same car, to put it in technical philosophy of language context, you have a token of the same type. I have the same make and model and so forth. That's not the same thing as saying it's identical. Even identical twins, which is a misnomer, it's confusing. Why do we call them identical twins? Identical implies one. Twin implies two. They're not identical. They are merely qualitatively similar. Do you understand? If they were identical, then there would only be one. Numerical identity is to say it is the exact same thing. Somebody stole my bike. By that I mean the bike that you're riding right now is numerically identical with the bike that is mine. I wouldn't say, hey, you stole my bike. That one's very similar to mine. That's a weird way of talking. With questions of personal identity, you're interested in numerical identity. Rauhat talks about this on page 107 and 108, and you'll see a variation of it in Perry's reading for today on page 184. This is the key that they're talking about. Why is this important? Why is numerical identity important more so than qualitative identity with respect to personal identity? Think of it in terms of ethics. Think of it in terms of Stanley Tookie Williams. Did we execute the numerically same person who committed the crimes? Or do we only execute someone who is qualitatively similar to the criminal? That's a big difference. I'm going to go to sleep tonight. I have plans for what I am going to do tomorrow. I have plans for the future. I'm saving money right now for my retirement in 5 years or whenever. You were fine with that? The math on that made sense to you? I'm going to retire in 5 years. How old do you think I am that I would retire in 5 years? Let's pay attention. Nowhere near retirement. Closer to that 5-year-old than that. Anyway, that threw me off. You guys pissed me off just then. I don't know. What was I saying?
It wasn't rich, not old.
It wasn't necessarily that we thought you were old and you were retiring soon. We
Did
said
I have-
you were a teacher and you weren't retiring.
Oh. Ah. Okay. That's about accurate. Okay. When are you going to retire? I think when I'm dead. And then like Socrates, I'm going to keep teaching as I'm dying.
Let's see.
So, yes.
For numerical, what is time be appropriate to ask?
Oh, what relation does time have to do? Yeah, it's a very good question. And anytime you bring time in, time is extraordinarily difficult. the metaphysics of time. Is time a mental construct? Is it something that's independent of minds themselves, kind of like Locke's secondary primary qualities? What role does time have to play with respect to identity questions? So with respect to Stanley Tookie Williams, he murders, let's imagine, he is guilty. I think he professed he wasn't guilty, or I don't know all the details of it, but let's imagine we catch him in the crime. We see him do it. If we wanted to avoid the problem of time progressing and therefore leaving room for him to change and become a different person, we should execute him right there, to be truly just, because we want to make sure we get the right guy. If we wait too long, then we may end up executing the wrong person physically or the wrong person psychologically. We don't want someone who's merely qualitatively similar. That would be weird. We couldn't find the criminal who murdered these people, but you're very similar. We're going to use you. But I'm just his twin. I'm not really the same person. You're confusing numerical and qualitative identity, you might say. What relationship does time have with respect to our sense of self? I'm going to come back to that with something called the Ship of Theseus thought experiment in a couple of minutes. So remind me if I forget that. Yeah.
Well, like you were saying, if you watched him in the act, who says he's right after the act that he's the same person at that point?
Well, yeah, that would be.
And Ollie's doing it.
Yeah.
In that same argument, the time would make a huge difference there, because what is the change over time on that one? What if he's changed the second after the act is done?
I know. I can't believe my former self did that a second ago. I'm totally different. I'm a changed man. I found Jesus, whatever. Within that second, that seems implausible. But it doesn't seem implausible to say, I've completely changed psychologically, because you look at me as a child, look at you as a child, you're a totally different person now.
What if you looked at it at a body point of view? He's lost cells, he's now different.
He's a totally different body. Then we get back to the DNA. Who was talking about DNA earlier? Then we might say, well, the DNA is the same. And you might say, so what? That's not how I don't identify myself that way. What do you take to be you, essentially? My genetic material. That's me. Look at me there. And there's a double helix in a picture frame. That's me when I was whatever. Yeah.
Well,
Is it a double helix? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Then what would you consider being like a different person if you're constantly changing? Then what is the grade enough? Like if it's constant, like over time, like what would be the grade of you being a different person? Like from
I don't
that
know.
point, like at what point was he a different person? Like was it right after? Was it 10 years after? What did he still have a little bit to go? Like
That is a fundamental question that's related to something called the Sorites paradox. I don't recall talking about this yet, but it's known as the paradox of the heap, and it has to do with the problems in part of language that's vague. And it relates to free will, but in particular the identity question as well. When do I become me? Am I always me? Have I always been me? If so, we avoid this paradox. The paradox is this, the paradox of the heap, goes back to Greek philosophy. We're to ask, is that a pile or a heap of sand? That grain, right? That's a grain of sand right there. Does that constitute a pile? Anyone? Nobody would think that. What if I add one more grain at a time? Now I have 2 grains of sand. Do we have a pile or a heap of sand? On anyone's understanding of a pile of sand? Probably, presumably not. I continue going 1 grain of sand at a time. I keep doing that. Billions of grains at a time, right? No. Over time, billions of grains are added, but 1 at a time. The paradox is this. I can get to the point where I built a whole beach, but logically there was no non-arbitrary point at which I could have said, you didn't have a heap of sand before that grain. Add the grain, now it's a heap of sand. There's no non-arbitrary point at which we can draw that line, so it could lead to the absurd conclusion that there is no heap. It goes the other direction too. Here's a huge pile of sand, take away a grain. Take away a grain. Do you no longer have a heap of sand? No, that doesn't follow. You can do it with all sorts of other things. Going bald, becoming rich, and so on. Getting old, all of these things are subject to vagueness. Becoming you. When do you become you? Is it when you're a blastocyst? Notice I said when you're a blastocyst. That begs the question. Is it when that clump of cells is formed? Is it when there's a fetus? Is it when a baby is born and then that's you? And is it when you're named? All of those questions lead to this notion of a process where there's subject to vagueness. And since there's no obvious non-arbitrary point for which we can say, you weren't a person, you weren't a self, you weren't you until that minute or that second. That's your question. Where do we draw that line? You avoid that paradox, that problem, by saying you are ensouled at the moment or when conception begins. That's one way of avoiding these problems. And we'll see in the reading today, Chaplain Miller will make that case.
So then what would philosophers say about abortion?
What would philosophers as a group say?
Well, not as a group, but like what would people with the series say about, would they say that abortion is not okay?
This metaphysical question relates to the abortion debate as well, precisely. Although we would be cautious, what do philosophers think? That's a different type of question than what do scientists think, because you can get consensus on what scientists think, but with philosophers, you will not get consensus. However, philosophers are aware of that, and I think good philosophers are recognizing that the abortion debate is one that has a lot of metaphysical presuppositions. People bring to the table, this is what a person is, and this is when it's a person, and this is what a human right is, and this is what a person right is, and you bring that into the debate prior to arguing for it. And we each have our own presuppositions about when a person is a person. I think that question has to be answered before you can establish whether abortion is morally right or morally wrong. But we don't do that. Mainly because we don't give a shit about philosophy in this society, and that upsets me. That's changing a little bit, but not enough. I think the abortion debate is primarily a philosophical issue of metaphysics, which is not separable from ethics. So I can't answer what philosophers think about it, but I can tell you they do think about it in terms like this, trying to figure out what constitutes, first of all, a person, and what's the difference between a person and a non-person, which gets us to these questions. So you were right to ask that question. It's a very good question. Yeah.
So from a philosophical standpoint, the people who are pro-life actually have a stronger foundation because they can at least pinpoint when life is formed, where the other side would be subject to that sand fallacy.
Correct. Now notice, when I introduce a solution to a problem, as we've seen so far, I might be introducing other problems. I can solve the Sorites paradox or avoid it, sidestep it, the problem of vagueness. Where are you going to draw the line? When do you get a person? Oh, we don't have to worry about that. It's the moment of conception. Boom, that problem's gone. Does it introduce new problems? Why is it the moment of, when is the moment of conception? How is a soul brought into a body? What, is it like Stewie again? Did I talk about that?
Yeah.
Stewie? Is the soul in a sperm? Is it come about from the fertilization, then the soul is there? So notice it might solve a problem, but introduce others. And I guess the other side would say, yeah, you're solving that problem, but you're introducing even bigger problems, or something like that. So it's not an easy matter. Anytime somebody tells you the abortion debate is simple, it's this or that, I'll guess you should guess they're probably not considering their presuppositions. All right, so here are some of the questions. I'm not going to answer them now, but what counts? Primates, at least in Spain a number of years ago, were recently granted certain rights that were only previously attributable to human persons. And I see human persons because now we can see that what counts as a person is not obviously just a human. And it's not clear that anything that's human is automatically a person. Those concepts don't always go together. As an example, by the Supreme Court in the United States a couple of years ago decided what? What decision did they make related to person rights having to do with donations of money to political campaigns? Nobody knows what I'm talking about? Corporations? Oh, why do I do this? Where is it? What is it?
Are you talking about citizenship?
Having to do with whether or not corporations can donate money.
Yeah.
And Mitt Romney was running for president at this time, and he was asked, what do you think of the court case, the Supreme Court decision that gave certain rights to corporations with respect to free speech and donating of money and so forth? Because typically only humans, persons, have the right to free speech, not corporations. And his response was, corporations are people too, my friends. Okay, why does he say that? And what potential fallacy might he be guilty of by saying that? There it is. Wow, that came out fast. Well done. Why? Well, a corporation is comprised of people. Therefore, a corporation is a people? Yeah. A church is a people, the thing you do. People can be punished for doing wrong. We understand how that might go. How does a corporation get punished? In the same way a person does? That doesn't obviously follow. All right, we have 12 more minutes. Let's move on. Then the next question is, what is personal identity? Gosh, I keep forgetting. And here are some options. And the text calls the bodily continuity view the animalism, or the bodily view, something like that. That's simply to say, identity of self through time is determined by your body. You can get more specific, as we did there with the brain, or even more specific than that part of the brain. We might like that idea. That's how we recognize people, by their physical appearances. But it's unclear that that's sufficient for establishing identity, because you can imagine losing an arm, or losing a pinky finger. I think Locke talks about this. If I lost a pinky finger, have I become a different person? I don't think that follows.
So, but like, we have rights, and part of our rights aren't just pertain to our consciousness, they pertain to our body too. So would
right.
you argue that, like, tools that we use, like our phones, would be an extension of our body and should be protected?
That's too tough. That's too tough to answer here. We can talk about that with the mind-body debate. There's a guy named Andy Clark, philosopher in Scotland, Ireland, somewhere, who argues that even writing on a piece of paper is an extension of your mind. And I think one of the conclusions of his argument is that we ought to have rights the same way that I have the right to my own thought in my head, and you should not be able to access that if I don't want you to. The government ought not be able to access my iPhone or whatever, because that's an extension of my mind. I don't think it was an intended consequence of his theory of mind. He's a philosopher of mind. But it's interesting to use that kind of argument to justify keeping the government out of your computer stuff that holds your thoughts in a way, it's an extension of you, a self, so to speak. We'll talk more about that too in the coming classes, and you already have an inclination that this is possible. In fact, I'll bet most of you have an intuition that the self isn't the brain or the body, but it's the mind. Because when you watch Freaky Friday, as you all have, you understand when they say the daughter is now in the body of the mom, or is now in the mom's body, or however they phrase it. You understand that and say, yeah, it makes sense. When you watch the movie, was the Johnny Depp movie where he gets downloaded onto the internet? Oh, come on. Transcendence? Yes. I don't know how great the movie was, but the idea, of course, is pushing this thought experiment that we are minds. It's not our body. It doesn't matter what our bodies are. It matters where our consciousness and memories are. And you see this with the story with Gretchen. She's been in a terrible accident. Her body's crushed. Her brain is perfectly fine. And she has 3 days left to live, and she starts pondering these deep questions of identity and immortality, which we're not going to be able to get to the story in detail yet. We're sort of just introducing all of the underlying conceptual frameworks toward this. But we've gone a long way to explaining what's happening in that story. But we can imagine in the very near future, somebody like Gretchen's situation, she could actually survive that. They've done 10, 15 years ago, an Italian scientist decided, I'm going to try to take this monkey's head and put it on that monkey's body. And he did it. A lot of people were up in arms about it, saying, why would you do that? And I think his justification was, someone's going to do it eventually, I might as well be the first. And it worked to an extent. The monkey died after 3 days, but it worked. It's logically possible that if my body's damaged but my brain is fine, I can take that brain, as I take hearts and transplant them, and put it into somebody else's body. Question?
I was gonna say, what if you were talking about how everything's things are mind dependent? If that's in terms of appearance, then wouldn't it make more sense to say that the soul and your mind is what is you? Because if you're projecting what you think someone looks like, would that make more sense to say that?
You make, like we talked about a moment ago, by invoking the soul, you do avoid a lot of problems. But mind is different because I can change my mind. And notice how I talk. I can change my mind. Just as I can scratch my hand. Do you see the grammatical difference? I'm not saying I am my hand. I'm saying I possess. The I has it. Do I have a mind? If I have a mind, then the I, the self, is something in addition to, separable from, a mind. Same thing with soul. Do I have a soul? Such that I possess it like I do a hand? If so, then my identity is not connected necessarily. It's not the same thing as a soul. Or do we rather want to say, I am a soul, or I am a mind? If it's the case that I'm a mind, then we have the psychological continuity view. And it is the same thinking, conscious being through time. The question is then, how do we establish numerical identity with minds? The same problem arises as with bodies. The body changes as does the mind over time.
But say you have an AI. AI is to change their own code. If you were to have a conscious AI, its mind would be what it's changing. It would literally be changing its mind, its code.
It would be changing its mind. So, right, it's a self-reflective or in a sense we might call it biofeedback, but in this case not bio.
If we were mind, why couldn't we be changing our own mind?
You could be.
It would be, if we are still mind, we're just changing.
That's the question. Then is there something that's undergoing the change? And it's the mind. And what's making the change? The mind.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
But then it's not all the opposites change.
The question is, can we allow for that notion of change and keep the necessary, presumably it's necessary, maybe we're not wrong about that, but the necessary connection of numerical identity. I don't want qualitative identity. I want to be me, numerically identical to me in the afterlife. I don't want somebody, I don't want to enjoy heaven. Let's imagine I believe in heaven, and yet it be someone qualitatively similar to me. I'm being really, really good, so I get to heaven. And it turns out, oh, that's not even me. It's just somebody similar to me. Well, that's not right. It's got to be me, identically me. And in a way, avoiding those problems, as I mentioned, we can invoke the soul, or you can invoke a bunch of these things, a combination of them. And oftentimes that's what happens. But I want you to be cautious about that. Sometimes you can take the best of both theories, so to speak, and meld them together. Sometimes in doing that, however, you get the worst of both theories. And you may multiply the problems. So while it's oftentimes beneficial to try to find some consistency, compatibility between different theories with respect to, for instance, this problem of identity, you have to be cautious that you don't multiply your problems. And also, it may be the case that these two views are contradictory, and you just can't hold them both at the same time without absurdity. I mean, I might say capitalism makes the most sense to me. I'm a thoroughgoing capitalist. But you know what? I like communism too. So I'm a capital communist. I don't even know what that would be. It would be nothing because you've contradicted yourself. You can't be a capitalist communist. I don't think. Unless you just don't know what those words mean. I'm a Christian, but I'm an atheist. I don't think you are. You're one or the other. Right? You could be Jewish and an atheist. That's different. That's for a different class, but that's different. Question?
What about agnostic? Isn't that a little bit?
That's a little bit different. Are you a Christian if you're agnostic? That's tough. Too tough for us to address right now in the last 3 minutes. So let's hold off on that until we get to philosophy of religion. So, and then there's the other one. We solve the problem. We dissolve the problem. What is this nature of self through time? Oh, there is no self. The Buddhists will make, some versions of Buddhism make this case from an ethical standpoint. When I achieve enlightenment, the Buddha says, you will recognize your interdependence of everything. You will recognize that you are not a separate individual self, independent of everyone else. And recognizing that, you'll recognize that what causes suffering is your desires for things, for you, for a self. Once the self dissolves in that way, you recognize and have achieved nirvana. There is no self, there is no enduring identical thing through time. David Hume is going to say something similar, but for very different reasons. So Buddhism and David Hume have similar viewpoints. But that's not very plausible to most of us upon first hearing it. Say, what? Of course I'm a self through time. It's either my body, or it's my mind, or it's my soul, or something like that. Real quick, it just occurred to me. We were talking about head transplants and technology. The rise of technology changes the way that we can think about possibilities. Years ago, there was a face transplant. The first one was done, and it worked. Imagine having your face transplanted and then looking in the mirror and recognizing not you, but something else, someone else. That technology is there. In fact, you may have read about this. I'll let you go after this. In the LA Times, I don't know if you guys read papers, but there was a child born without eyelids. Anyone see that story? Born without eyelids at all. Yeah, that happens apparently. And the doctors, that can't be, so we have to fix that. And they decided, very clever doctor, we can kill two birds with one stone. After the circumcision. Yes. After the circumcision. Don't leave yet. I know it's hard to accept. And they formed eyelids, and that procedure worked. The kid is a little cockeyed, but beyond that, the procedure worked. So that never happened, but it could have. I guess I'm done. So, all right. Keep up with the readings. Meredith Michaels. It's short. Make sure you read it. Could be a quiz next time.